The deputy paused at the edge of the drainage culvert as snow hissed across the gravel, his flashlight catching a shoe half buried, frost stiffening the laces, paperwork fluttering in the cold, and a calendar date ticking toward midnight, when the quiet certainty arrived that nothing here would be simple. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In January of 2003, winter pressed hard against the hills of central Tennessee, flattening the fields outside Cookeville and mooting the two-lane roads that wound between farms and small subdivisions. The holidays had just passed, Thanksgiving decorations still boxed in garages, Christmas trees browning on curbs, New Year calendars newly thumbtacked in kitchens. It was the season when routine slowed, when neighbors noticed unfamiliar cars, and when absences felt sharper against the cold. Emily Carter was 22 years old, a college student working evenings at a local diner off Interstate 40, saving money, planning a spring semester that never arrived. She lived alone in a small apartment near North Washington Avenue, a practical place with thin walls, baseboard heat, and a view of the courthouse dome when the trees were bare. On December 31st, she finished a late shift, signed out, and told a coworker she was heading home. Snow was forecast, light but persistent, and the county road crews were already laying salt. Emily never made it to her apartment. Her mother called the Cookeville Police Department on New Year's Day after the phone rang unanswered and a neighbor reported mail piling up. Officers performed a welfare check and found the apartment locked, lights off, Emily's car missing from its usual space. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, nothing that suggested a struggle. Her purse was gone, as were her keys. The thermostat was turned low, a detail noted in the report because the power had remained on, and the heat would have kept pipes from freezing if she had planned to be away. The initial classification was a missing adult, voluntary absence possible. Flyers were printed in black and white at the station, Emily's photograph taped to bulletin boards at gas stations and grocery stores. Local radio read her description during weather updates. Snow fell and fell again, erasing footprints, smoothing shoulders, complicating searches along the back roads she might have traveled. Within days, the tone shifted. Emily's bank card showed no activity after December 31st. Her cell phone last pinged a tower near the interstate, then went dark. A friend reported an uneasy conversation weeks earlier about someone who had been watching the diner parking lot. Detectives canvassed the route between the restaurant and her apartment, knocking on doors, asking about unfamiliar vehicles, checking surveillance tapes that were grainy and often overwritten. The diner's cameras captured her leaving at 11:47 p.m., bundled in a coat, carrying a to-go bag. Outside, snowflakes streaked past the lens. That image would be replayed for years. On January 4th, a county road worker noticed debris in a culvert off a rural spur west of town, near a stand of cedar and a mailbox leaning with age. That was where the deputy paused, where the shoe lay half buried, where frost stiffened the laces. The scene was secured without spectacle. Photographs were taken. Measurements were logged. The medical examiner arrived, noting the cold's preservative effect, the absence of obvious trauma that could be seen without disturbing the scene. Emily Carter was identified by dental records later that day. She was 22. The autopsy, conducted in Nashville due to caseloads and expertise, suggested death by exposure following incapacitation, with toxicology pending. There were no sharp force injuries, no gunshot wounds, no fractures that could be conclusively tied to violence. Bruising was consistent with restraint, the report cautious in its language. Time of death was estimated within hours of her disappearance. The lack of definitive cause complicated the path forward. Detectives reconstructed the timeline minute by minute, from the diner exit to the last cell phone signal. They examined tire tracks preserved in the ditch, cast impressions, compared them to local vehicles. They interviewed men who frequented the diner, co-workers, ex-boyfriends, customers who paid cash and lingered. They pulled police records for similar incidents. None matched cleanly. Media attention grew measuredly. The local paper ran updates beside weather reports and high school sports, the tone respectful, restrained. The courthouse steps saw brief gatherings of friends holding candles, breath visible in the cold. Thanksgiving came again that year without answers. Snow returned, and with it the quiet accumulation of a case file thickening with paper. Leads came and went. A pickup truck seen near the interstate could not be placed. A man questioned passed a polygraph, a tool noted but not decisive. DNA collected from Emily's clothing was insufficient for a profile by the standards of the time. Evidence was boxed, labeled, stored in a climate-controlled room that hummed year-round. Years passed, detectives retired, the case cooled. It was revisited each winter by a new officer reading the old reports, tracing the same roads, feeling the same frustration. Emily's mother kept the flyers in a drawer, edges soft from handling. She marked calendars still. The town grew, cameras improved. The diner changed hands. The interstate widened. Thanksgiving editorials about gratitude shared space with reminders of an unsolved loss. Snow fell less often, but when it did, the culvert off the rural spur looked unchanged. In 2019, the department received funding to review cold cases with modern forensic tools. Evidence was re-inventoried. The shoe, the coat fibers, the scrapings from under fingernails were submitted again. This time, a partial DNA profile emerged, not enough for a direct match but sufficient for genetic genealogy. Procedures were followed, warrants obtained, databases queried within legal bounds. A family tree began to form, branches narrowing toward a man who had lived near Cookeville in 2003, who drove a pickup with tires matching old impressions, who had been questioned and released. His name would not be public yet. Investigators built the case patiently, corroborating with cell records now retrievable, employment logs, witness recollections refreshed by photographs and maps. By the winter of 2022, with snow flurries dusting the courthouse steps again, prosecutors reviewed the file and authorized an arrest. The community reacted quietly, shock tempered by time. The legal process moved forward methodically. The evidence, once thin, now aligned. In a courtroom warmed against the cold, closure approached, not loudly, but with the steady turning of pages and the calm acknowledgement of truth. The renewed investigation began with the careful reopening of boxes sealed nearly 2 decades earlier, cardboard softened by age and marked with dates written by hands long retired. Each item was logged again, chain of custody verified, storage conditions reviewed, because nothing could move forward without procedural integrity. Snow lay thin on the ground outside the station, a familiar backdrop that mirrored the winter when Emily Carter vanished. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit worked deliberately, understanding that memory fades but records endure. They reread original reports, noting inconsistencies that once seemed minor but now stood out. A timestamp here, a location phrased vaguely there, details that technology of the early 2000s could not resolve. The goal was not speed but clarity, and the process unfolded slowly, almost reverently. Advances in forensic science provided the first meaningful shift. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Laboratory re-examined biological material collected from Emily's clothing, using methods unavailable in 2003. Where earlier testing produced inconclusive results, newer techniques isolated a partial male DNA profile. It was not enough for entry into the national database for a direct hit, but it met the threshold for investigative genealogy. Before proceeding, Detectives sought guidance from prosecutors and obtained judicial authorization, ensuring compliance with evolving privacy standards. This step marked a turning point, not because it guaranteed an answer, but because it opened a path that had not previously existed. The work moved from the physical landscape of roads and culverts to the abstract terrain of family trees and historical records. Genealogists contracted through lawful channels began mapping potential relatives connected to the DNA profile. Census data, birth records, obituaries, and public archives were cross-referenced, building a network of names that gradually narrowed. Many branches led nowhere, but one line pointed back to Putnam County in the early 2000s. The individual at the center of that branch had lived less than 5 miles from the diner where Emily worked. In 2003, he was 38 years old, employed intermittently in construction, and owned a dark-colored pickup truck. He had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation after a coworker mentioned seeing his vehicle near the diner late at night. At the time, no physical evidence connected him to Emily, and he denied knowing her beyond casual contact. Detectives approached the renewed inquiry with caution, aware of confirmation bias. They corroborated every genealogical finding with independent evidence. Archived phone records, once thought inaccessible, were retrieved through service providers that had since digitized old logs. Analysis showed that the suspect's phone connected to the same cellular tower as Emily's during the narrow window between her leaving work and her disappearance. Employment records confirmed he had not been scheduled to work the following morning, contradicting his earlier statement that he went home early to rest. Witness interviews were conducted again, framed carefully to avoid leading questions. One former diner employee recalled a regular customer who lingered during closing hours, a memory sharpened by photographs shown during the interview. Winter weather played a subtle but persistent role in the reconstruction. Snowfall records from the National Weather Service were reviewed to estimate road conditions that night. Investigators determined that certain rural routes would have been less traveled, making the Culvert location a plausible disposal site for someone familiar with back roads. Vehicle registration data from 2003 showed that the suspect's truck was equipped with all-terrain tires matching the width and tread pattern documented in old photographs from the scene. Although the original casts had degraded, measurements recorded in reports allowed for comparison. Each piece alone was circumstantial, but together, they formed a coherent narrative that aligned with the forensic findings. In early 2022, detectives requested a voluntary DNA sample from the suspect, now living in another Tennessee county. The request was made through legal counsel, and when it was declined, investigators obtained a warrant supported by the accumulated evidence. The sample confirmed a match to the partial profile recovered from Emily's clothing, reaching a statistical probability sufficient for prosecution. The arrest occurred quietly in late December, days before New Year's Eve, under a gray sky that hinted at snow. There were no crowds, no spectacle, only the measured execution of a warrant nearly 19 years in the making. News spread through local outlets with restrained language, emphasizing process over drama. Court proceedings unfolded over the following months. Prosecutors presented a timeline reconstructed from records, expert testimony explaining the forensic methods, and documentation of the suspect's prior statements that conflicted with verified data. The defense challenged the reliability of genealogical techniques and the passage of time, but motions were addressed within established legal frameworks. The jury heard about Emily Carter not as a symbol, but as a person whose final hours could be traced with sober precision. Autopsy findings were contextualized to explain how exposure, combined with incapacitation, led to her death without sensational detail. The emphasis remained on facts, corroboration, and the integrity of the investigation. In the summer of 2023, the verdict was returned. The suspect was found guilty of second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse, charges reflecting the evidentiary limits and statutory definitions applicable to the case. Sentencing took place in the same courthouse visible from Emily's former apartment, now renovated and occupied by new tenants unaware of its history. The judge imposed a lengthy prison term, noting the prolonged impact of the crime on the victim's family and the community. There was no outburst, only the subdued finality that accompanies lawful resolution. Appeals were filed and later denied, affirming the verdict. The aftermath settled into a quieter register. Emily's mother attended the final hearing, then returned home to a house filled with winters endured without answers. She spoke briefly to reporters, expressing gratitude for persistence rather than triumph. The Cookeville Police Department updated its cold case registry, marking Emily Carter's file as solved. Officers involved in the reopening reflected privately on the importance of preservation and patience. Each Thanksgiving and New Year thereafter carried a different weight, the absence still present but no longer undefined. Snow continued to fall on the rural spur road, but the culvert no longer held questions, only the memory of how long justice can take and how methodical work can eventually reach it. As the legal process concluded, attention turned back to the original investigation to understand how the case had slipped into dormancy for so long. Internal reviews are rarely public, but records obtained later showed a frank assessment of early limitations. In 2003, Cookeville was growing but still operated with a department sized for a smaller town. Detectives handled multiple serious cases simultaneously, and forensic resources were constrained by technology and budget. The absence of a clear cause of death beyond exposure, combined with minimal physical evidence, had forced investigators to rely heavily on witness recollections that were inconsistent and vulnerable to time. The winter weather that preserved Emily Carter also erased many of the transient clues that might have pointed more directly to her killer. The review highlighted how investigative priorities shifted in the early weeks. Once Emily's body was recovered, resources focused on determining how she died rather than who was responsible. That distinction mattered. Exposure deaths, particularly those without overt trauma, often fall into ambiguous territory where intent is difficult to prove. The medical examiner's careful wording reflected professional caution, but it also narrowed prosecutorial options. Without a clear mechanism of homicide, early prosecutors advised patience rather than risk a weak case. This decision, documented in memos, would shape the trajectory of the investigation for years. The suspect later identified remained on a list of interest, but without evidence sufficient for charges, he faded into the background of a growing archive. The town's memory of the case evolved alongside its physical landscape. Cookeville's downtown underwent redevelopment, new storefronts replacing older businesses. The diner where Emily worked closed in 2008, reopened under a different name, and eventually became a family restaurant with no trace of its former life. Interstate traffic increased, bringing new residents who knew nothing of the flyers once taped to gas pumps. Yet among longtime residents, particularly older men who followed local news closely, the case remained a quiet reference point. It was mentioned in barber shops during winter storms, in letters to the editor around Thanksgiving, framed as a reminder of vulnerability even in familiar places. Detectives assigned to cold cases often describe their work as archival rather than investigative, at least initially. In Emily's case, this meant digitizing thousands of pages, converting cassette-recorded interviews into searchable audio files, and scanning photographs that had faded slightly with age. Each task carried the risk of uncovering overlooked details. One such detail was a notation in a patrol log about a dark pickup scene idling near the diner after closing on December 31st. The note had been entered by a rookie officer and never followed up because it lacked a license plate number. When revisited years later, it aligned with the suspect's known habits and vehicle description. It was not decisive on its own, but it reinforced the emerging pattern. The genealogical process that eventually identified the suspect also revealed broader implications for law enforcement. Training materials developed afterward emphasized the importance of consent, transparency, and judicial oversight when using public DNA databases. Emily Carter's case became an internal example cited during seminars, not as a cautionary tale of failure, but as evidence of how patience and evolving tools can complement traditional methods. The case underscored the necessity of preserving evidence even when immediate prospects seem limited. Had the clothing and trace materials been discarded under older retention policies, the outcome would have been different. The suspect's history, examined during sentencing, painted a picture that was neither sensational nor easily dismissed. He had no prior violent felony convictions, but a pattern of boundary violations emerged through witness statements collected after his arrest. Former acquaintances described behavior that was controlling, occasionally aggressive, but often dismissed as socially awkward rather than dangerous. In 2003, such patterns were less likely to trigger scrutiny unless accompanied by overt criminal acts. This context mattered to the jury, not as character assassination, but as explanation for how he could have remained under the radar. It also illustrated how community perceptions can influence investigative momentum. Emily's family navigated the post-verdict period with a mix of relief and enduring grief. Closure, as described in victim advocacy literature, rarely erases loss. Instead, it replaces uncertainty with a defined narrative. For Emily's mother, this meant no longer imagining endless possibilities during winter nights. She donated her daughter's remaining belongings to charity and requested that the roadside memorial near the culvert be removed, preferring remembrance without a physical marker. The landowner agreed, and the spot returned to anonymity, indistinguishable from countless other rural intersections dusted with snow. Local media followed the aftermath briefly, then moved on. Coverage shifted from the arrest to broader discussions about cold cases nationwide, placing Emily's story within a larger context. Editorials praised the restraint shown by investigators and prosecutors, noting the absence of leaks or speculation. For an older audience accustomed to sensational true crime, the case stood out for its procedural steadiness. It demonstrated that resolution does not require spectacle, only adherence to method and time. The courthouse files were sealed where appropriate, accessible to researchers under standard conditions, ensuring transparency without intrusion. In the years following the conviction, Cookeville implemented modest changes inspired in part by the case review. Patrol officers received additional training on detailed field notes, emphasizing that even minor observations can gain significance over time. Evidence retention policies were extended, and partnerships with state and federal laboratories were formalized to ensure access to emerging technologies. None of these changes were announced as direct responses to Emily Carter's case, but internally, the connection was understood. Institutional learning often occurs quietly, embedded in policy updates rather than public statements. Seasonal rhythms continued to frame remembrance. Each Thanksgiving brought editorials about gratitude and reflection, sometimes mentioning resolved cases as examples of perseverance. New Year's Eve passed with fireworks and church bells, the date no longer solely associated with disappearance, but still marked privately by those who remembered. Snowfall records accumulated, winters blending together. The cold case unit archived Emily's file permanently, labeled solved, yet retained for training and historical reference. The box returned to storage carried a different weight now, its contents no longer questions but answers. For those who followed the case closely over 2 decades, particularly older men who valued order and accountability, the resolution affirmed a belief in steady institutions. It reinforced the idea that time does not negate responsibility, and that systems, though imperfect, can correct themselves. Emily Carter's name entered local history not as a mystery, but as a reminder of diligence. Her story ended not with dramatic revelation, but with documentation, sentencing transcripts, and a final notation in a ledger. In the quiet that followed, the town moved forward, carrying the knowledge that even in the coldest seasons, persistence can bring truth to light. The solved designation did not end professional interest in the case, because resolution invites scrutiny as much as relief. Training officers, archivists, and prosecutors continued to examine how the investigation matured across decades, focusing on procedural patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Emily Carter's file became an example used to explain how cold cases age, how evidence retains value when handled properly, and how seasonal context can influence both crime and memory. Winter nights, holiday routines, and reduced traffic all shaped the offender's choices in 2003, and understanding those factors mattered for future prevention as much as retrospective justice. One aspect repeatedly analyzed was the geographic familiarity demonstrated by the offender. The rural spur road where Emily was left was not visible from the highway and did not appear on tourist maps. It was a route known primarily to locals who used it as a shortcut during bad weather. Investigators mapped historical driving patterns using archived county maintenance logs, noting which roads were salted and which remained untreated during snowfalls. The suspect's residence placed him within a network of such roads, suggesting habitual use rather than random discovery. This geographic analysis reinforced the prosecution's argument that the location choice was intentional and informed. Another element examined was opportunity. Late December employment schedules showed that many residents worked irregular hours around the holidays, creating unpredictable patterns. Emily's diner closed later on New Year's Eve, a detail confirmed by payroll records and corroborated by coworkers. That extension narrowed the window of disappearance and explained why fewer witnesses were present. Snow muffled sound and discouraged loitering, reducing the likelihood of immediate intervention. These factors were not framed as excuses, but as conditions that facilitated the crime. Understanding them helped contextualize why the case initially resisted resolution. The offender's post-arrest interview, conducted with counsel present, provided limited information. He denied intent to cause harm, maintaining that events escalated unexpectedly. Investigators compared these statements with physical evidence and found inconsistencies that were addressed during trial. The restrained manner in which the interview was conducted adhered to modern standards, avoiding coercion and ensuring admissibility. For those studying the case later, the interview transcript illustrated how little offenders sometimes reveal even when confronted with evidence, reinforcing the importance of corroboration over confession. Community reaction after sentencing remained subdued. There were no marches or public memorials, only a brief candlelight vigil organized by Emily's former classmates on the courthouse lawn during a light snowfall. Participants stood quietly, coats buttoned, breath visible, then dispersed without speeches. The vigil was covered by a single local reporter, whose article focused on remembrance rather than the offender. This restraint reflected both the town's character and the passage of time. Grief had settled into something quieter, more private. Emily Carter's academic records showed she had been studying criminal justice, a detail noted by commentators with caution to avoid irony. She had expressed interest in victim advocacy, according to a college advisor interviewed years later. This information did not influence the investigation, but it added a layer of reflection for those involved in resolving her case. It underscored the human dimension behind procedural work, reminding investigators that files represent lives interrupted. From an institutional perspective, the case contributed to a gradual cultural shift regarding cold cases. Rather than viewing them as static, departments increasingly treated them as dynamic archives awaiting technological progress. Funding proposals cited Emily's case as evidence that investment yields results, even if delayed. Grants supported evidence digitization, database integration, and interagency cooperation. None of these initiatives promised immediate outcomes, but collectively they strengthened capacity. The case demonstrated that time, when paired with method, can be an ally rather than an enemy. Seasonal markers continued to anchor reflection. Each winter, detectives involved in the reopening noted how snow altered their perception of the case. Visiting the Culvert site years later during similar conditions clarified visibility, sound travel, and isolation in ways summer visits could not. These observations were documented and shared during training sessions, emphasizing the importance of revisiting scenes under conditions that match the original event. Such practices became part of standard cold case review protocols. The offender entered the state correctional system quietly, assigned an identification number, processed without incident. His appeals exhausted, his name appeared only occasionally in public records. For Emily's family, knowing where he was and that he would remain there provided a measure of stability. Victim services maintained contact, offering support without intrusion. The family declined further public engagement, preferring privacy over advocacy. Their choice was respected. Local law enforcement officers who worked the case experienced a form of professional closure. Some attended the sentencing, others read the transcript later. For those who had been young officers in 2003, now approaching retirement, the resolution bridged careers. It validated early instincts that had lacked proof and reinforced lessons learned through experience. The department recorded oral histories, capturing these reflections for future generations of officers. The town itself absorbed the resolution into its collective memory. New residents learned of the case through quiet conversations, not headlines. Older residents referenced it when discussing changes in policing and technology. It became part of Cookeville's narrative, not as a defining tragedy, but as an example of persistence. The courthouse, roads, and neighborhoods continued their routines, unchanged in appearance but layered with history. As years passed, Emily Carter's name appeared less frequently in print, but it remained in official registries and training manuals. Her case influenced policy more than public discourse, shaping how evidence was preserved and how patience was valued. The snowy season that once marked uncertainty now marked remembrance without questions. Thanksgiving gatherings included unspoken acknowledgments of gratitude for answers finally given. New Year calendars turned without the weight of unresolved absence. In the end, the case affirmed a principle often understated in true crime narratives. Resolution is rarely dramatic. It is administrative, evidentiary, and deliberate. It unfolds through paperwork, laboratory reports, warrants, and court dates. It concludes with a sentence entered into a database and a file marked complete. Emily Carter's story closed in this manner, with lawful finality. The quiet afterward was not emptiness but order restored, allowing memory to settle into history, and history to instruct those who continue the work. In the final year after the conviction, the file labeled Emily Carter remained active only in administrative terms, its movement recorded when requested for audit or training. What lingered was not procedural but reflective. Investigators who had worked the reopening found themselves reconsidering assumptions made early in their careers, recognizing how easily a case can stall when evidence appears thin and time exerts pressure. Emily's death illustrated how absence of immediate clarity does not equal absence of accountability. It also demonstrated how patience, often misunderstood as inaction, can preserve the possibility of resolution. The forensic record, once sparse, had become a layered document showing the evolution of scientific standards. Early laboratory reports emphasized limitations, cautious language, and probabilities that failed to reach prosecutorial thresholds. Later reports, written with greater confidence due to refined methods, showed how identical samples yielded more information when examined through a modern lens. This contrast became instructive. Training sessions used anonymized excerpts to teach younger officers why evidence must be preserved even when it seems unhelpful. The lesson was not optimism, but responsibility to future capability. Emily Carter's timeline was eventually reconstructed with a precision impossible in 2003. Payroll systems confirmed her clock-out time to the minute. Cellular data revealed movement patterns that aligned with roadway distances and traffic conditions. Weather logs explained delays and isolation. Together, these elements transformed an uncertain narrative into a coherent sequence. Investigators emphasized that this coherence emerged only through aggregation, not revelation. No single discovery solved the case. Instead, it was the convergence of small, verified facts accumulated patiently over time. The legal outcome stood on that accumulation. The conviction was upheld because each evidentiary link was independently supported. There were no shortcuts, no reliance on confession, no appeals to emotion. For a justice system often criticized for haste or spectacle, the case represented the opposite. It moved slowly, deliberately, and within established bounds. Observers noted that this approach reduced grounds for appeal and increased confidence in the verdict. The process itself became part of the resolution. For Emily's family, the years following sentencing were quieter but not empty. Grief counseling records, later summarized by advocates, showed a gradual shift from acute trauma to reflective mourning. Holidays remained difficult, but the nature of difficulty changed. Thanksgiving no longer carried the uncertainty of unanswered questions. New Year's Eve no longer marked disappearance but remembrance. Snowfall, once associated with fear and isolation, became neutral again. These changes were subtle, not dramatic but meaningful. The town's response reflected its demographics. Older residents, particularly men who had followed the case through newspapers rather than social media, expressed appreciation for restraint. Letters to the editor praised law enforcement for persistence without publicity. Conversations in diners and hardware stores referenced the case as an example of work done properly, even if slowly. There was no appetite for dramatization. The prevailing sentiment favored closure, achieved through diligence rather than noise. Institutionally, the case influenced record-keeping culture. Digital archiving expanded, and interagency agreements ensured that evidence would not remain siloed. Detectives learned to document context more thoroughly, understanding that future investigators might lack the lived experience of the original moment. Weather, traffic patterns, and seasonal routines were given greater emphasis in reports. Emily's case was cited as justification, though never publicly highlighted as the sole reason. The offender's incarceration followed standard procedure. Intake assessments placed him within the general population. He participated minimally in programs and avoided attention. Periodic parole reviews were scheduled according to statute, with victim notifications issued as required. Each review resulted in denial, citing the severity of the offense and lack of demonstrated accountability. These decisions were documented plainly, without commentary. For Emily's family, the notifications were reminders, but also reassurances of stability. As time passed, Emily Carter's story transitioned fully into archival status. Researchers studying cold case resolution requested access to redacted files. Academic articles referenced the investigation as a case study in genealogical methodology, applied cautiously. Conferences on forensic science included brief mentions of how partial profiles can mature into decisive evidence when paired with lawful process. Emily's name appeared in footnotes rather than headlines, a sign of integration into professional knowledge rather than public spectacle. Seasonal anniversaries continued to prompt quiet acknowledgement. Each winter, a small wreath appeared anonymously near the courthouse entrance, placed without ceremony and removed after snow melted. No one claimed responsibility. It was understood as a gesture of remembrance rather than protest. The absence of crowds reflected acceptance rather than indifference. The town had absorbed the lesson and moved forward. For those who worked the case, retirement approached with a sense of completion. Oral histories recorded by the department captured their reflections, emphasizing restraint, patience, and respect for process. These recordings were archived alongside case files, intended for internal education. The message was consistent. Resolution is cumulative, not sudden. Emily Carter's case reinforced that truth more clearly than any policy memo. In broader context, the case aligned with national trends showing increased cold case resolutions through technology, but it remained distinctly local. The roads, the diner, the culvert, and the courthouse were ordinary places, not symbols. Their ordinariness underscored the reality that serious crimes often occur without spectacle. Understanding that reality, investigators argued, is essential for prevention and response. Emily Carter's life, as reconstructed through records and memories, was unremarkable in ways that mattered. She worked, studied, planned, and trusted familiar routines. Her death disrupted that ordinariness, and the long path to resolution tested communal faith in systems. That faith was ultimately justified, not by perfection, but by persistence. The final notation in the case file was brief. It recorded the conviction, sentence, and appellate status. There was no summative language, no commentary. The file was closed. What remained was the impact, distributed quietly across policy, practice, and memory. In the snowy seasons that followed, the town experienced winter as it always had, but with an added layer of understanding. Justice, delayed but delivered, had restored order without erasing loss. Emily Carter's name rested in history, no longer a question, but a resolved truth.